I'm Jon Snow, and I'm here to chair a debate about humanitarian issues to promote the work of Christian Aid both in man-made emergencies and indeed in natural disasters. It's fantastic work. Why am I here? Well, as well as being a hack, I'm actually somebody who did voluntary service overseas, and it changed my life, and I've wanted to put something back ever since.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming this morning. I just wanted to thank Christian Aid for the opportunity to host this panel discussion on their emergency humanitarian work around the world, and to thank Jon Snow for chairing it. At Latham and Watkins, we're delighted to be able to offer our facilities for this event. We've got a genuinely strong culture of supporting pro bono initiatives, and we encourage our legal and non-legal staff to participate, and I'm very pleased to see a good turnout from them this morning. Collectively, the firm provided nearly 200,000 hours of pro bono legal services in 2013 alone, valued at around $100 million at our rates, in areas such as veterans' rights, asylum and immigration, domestic violence, Holocaust reparations, anti-human trafficking, prisoners' rights, microfinance and entrepreneurialism, children and civil rights. And we're also very proud to have Christian Aid as a pro bono client of ours. Thank you in particular to Charlotte Davis, Charlotte Munro and Kate Raven at Christian Aid for organising this, and to my secretary Jacqueline Mackay for organising. And so without any more fuss, I'd like to hand over to Jon Snow to introduce the panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you very warmly to Latham and Watkins for making this event possible. I must say, in fact, when he talks about what they've been doing on the pro bono front, it is true, genuinely, that I spend my entire day job panning the bank and the banks and the law firms and the rest of it. But to be honest, below the surface, there is an amazing amount of activity going on. And as somebody who has to fundraise for assorted outfits, it's amazing the generosity that lurks beneath the waves here in the city. And here's one very strong manifestation. So thank you very, very warmly. So here we are to debate the future of humanitarian responses in a moment when times are utterly challenging on a massive scale. If we just reduce it to Syria, we're talking at least $40 million a week to feed those people that agencies like Christian Aid, through their partners, can reach. When those of us that are old enough to remember the Berlin Wall coming down, and I recognise that's a diminishing number, but those of us who are old enough to remember that moment genuinely thought that the coming down of the Berlin Wall was going to lead to a new world order. And in fact, actually, we are living in a new world disorder, a disorder which is only partially due to natural disasters, but natural disasters, some of which have been contributed to by our very selves through global warming. And then also there are, of course, the eternal development issues and those that are the product of conflict. And conflict is spreading across the Sahel region of Africa like a wildfire. Horrible events in Nigeria again today. Horrible events in the Central African Republic. Horrible events in South Sudan. These are immensely challenging times, and we've got a panel of four terrific people to talk about it. You may just wonder why some hack wants to come and be involved in this at all. And I should explain first that my father was a bishop, so I grew up in a circumstance which had some Christian undertones and quite a lot of overtones. I wouldn't call myself a passionate Christian, but I certainly lived in the environment. But I admired even then what Christian Aid was doing. But above and beyond anything else, I did voluntary service overseas in Uganda. And at that point, I looked north, and my very privileged life was changed forever. And I wanted to be a hack to try and put things right. But I also had an ambition to work for the United Nations, which I still haven't realised, but I'm working towards it. I'm still working towards it. So let me, without any more ado, introduce our panel. So Randolph is down this end, and he's Director of Humanitarian Futures Programme for King's College. It was established at the end of 2005. It was designed to help and enhance the adaptive anticipatory capacities of humanitarian organisations. And interestingly enough, he has input to work that Dylan Winder is doing at DFID, where he's head of humanitarian responses, an area of DFID's activity which has been discreetly boosted on a considerable level in recent years. Then right down here is Sean Lowry. He's director of the START Network, which is a network of NGOs which comes together to pitch together to institutions like DFID for expenditure on emergencies and humanitarian work. And last but not least, right from here, Christian Aid, Nick Goodman, who I've encountered in the field. And I should say I've also encountered as a reporter the work of Christian Aid in the field, not least in Haiti. One of the most devastating experiences anybody could ever have been subjected to come across very easily. This was the awful thing, that transport into Haiti was remarkably easy. You could fly into the Dominican Republic as if in some way it was just a passage to India. You'd just fly in and you could drive and suddenly you would be there, right on top of the most appalling catastrophe in which more than 250,000 people lay dead. And Christian Aid did amazing work to coordinate local agencies to come together and work their way, those that were still alive, work their way through the rubble. So let's start. So we have this situation in which there are 3 global crises, which are declared level L3, which is I think the highest possible level. I mean, if you've got to wrestle with those before anything else happens, and heaven knows what else is going to happen down the road, what does it mean in establishing sort of structures that can respond to this? If you've got a residual need to go on spending this kind of money, which is extremely hard money to raise, how do you work?
Well, it's a real challenge, but maybe firstly, thanks to everybody for coming, and Latham and Watkins for hosting this event. It's an increasing challenge having these very large-scale, protracted emergencies which we're having to deal with on a daily basis, and also all the emergencies that you probably never hear of at all. Just over the last few weeks, we've been supporting conflict in Myanmar, so crisis in Nigeria, so flooding, which you haven't heard of, and on top of that, having to deal with Syria, South Sudan, which are causing huge problems for us. I think the way in which we have to deal with it is actually radically re-looking at the way in which the humanitarian system is working at the moment. Well, there needs to be a shift from an expectation that the international, the UN, the international NGOs can do everything, to actually having local organisations a greater emphasis on providing local capacity to deliver a humanitarian response. If you're looking at Haiti or the typhoon that hit Philippines last year, it was the local people, local churches, mosques, local government, local Red Cross, local NGOs, local civil society, who actually provided the first line response. They did the life-saving work. It was too late by the time you get outsiders in to try and save lives after an earthquake or after that typhoon. People were dead. I mean, they'd be lucky if they saved 1 or 2 people, but the investment in that is huge. So it's much better to provide that investment to local organisations. If you help local people, organisations actually build their own capacity to dig people out after an earthquake, you're going to be much more successful, and it's much cheaper.
This goes to the root of how Christian Aid works, doesn't it? Because after all, basically, you go to any country, you've got partners on the ground, yes, through whom you are delivering aid. You're not just taking lots of foreigners in there and saying, which way do we go to get to the market?
Exactly. No, all Christian Aid's work is done through local organisations, and it's long-term partnerships with local organisations. It's not just going in and saying, right, actually, you seem to be a good organisation, we'll work with you on this emergency, and then have a contract with them to deliver. It's actually working with the local organisations. I mean, it was such an amazing example when I was in Philippines last year, where we were working with networks of local organisations, and we were able to have huge reach within days of the typhoon hitting. The local people knew where the crisis was, they knew where the most affected populations were, they had links into the smallest, most remote villages, and we were able to provide, with a lot of support from DFID and as well as the general public, really a very large number of basic urgent emergency items.
Randolph, when you have to analyse how these humanitarian structures work, where are we in this battle to provide?
Thank you very much, John. A very interesting question, and I think to a very significant extent, Nick answered some of the critical points. But let me add just a couple of points. One is, it's interesting, we talk about a system, and there is really no system other than what we perceive in a Western context, what the system is. And I think that's a fundamental point to bear in mind. Because basically what we're seeing globally is a transition from what you might call Western dominance, Western hegemony, into a far more diffuse structure. So in a sense, what our system is really less and less a system to a significant portion of the world. So that's the first point, if I may just make that. I think also, if you take a look at Nick's fundamental point about looking far more locally, engaging in local communities is so vitally important. But that said, let me just make another point here. It's all very well and good to engage with local communities, but do we dialogue with local communities? Do we say, I'm listening to you and I hear you, and maybe what we're offering you is not culturally sensitive, not institutionally sensitive from your particular point of view. In that context, I remember going to a meeting in Kuala Lumpur where there were 21 governments represented, and this was for the HERB, by the way, for the Humanitarian Emergency Response Review. And one of the consistent themes was, we don't want your boots on the ground anymore. If you have something that can help us technologically, in terms of prevention and preparedness, then we're interested. But there was a consistent theme throughout. We don't need your physical intervention in our kind of work. And then, if I may add one more point to this, when we're on that ground, when we are working in somebody else's country, I think it's really important to take a look at that system or those institutions and say, where does the private sector fit in? How are we engaging with them? It's not the private sector's philanthropy. It is the sustainability that the private sector needs that also leads to prevention and preparedness and to engagement in humanitarian work, which is all too often forgotten. We need to broaden the partnership, and the system, John, is at the country level, the community level.
That's an incredibly interesting point, because in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, the city was unbelievably devastated. And there was a structure in the middle of the city which meant everything to the local community, and it was the iron market. And a lunatic architect that I know had the very early commitment to get out there and see whether it could be rebuilt. And I remember thinking, heavens, no, people haven't got houses to live in, people can't feed themselves, and you want to go and build this iron market back up again. Today, the iron market is the absolute epicenter of the new Port-au-Prince. And what is fascinating is that he used local entrepreneurs, local suppliers of sand, cement, even the forging of the ironwork to rebuild this thing. So it was in itself part of the rehabilitation, humanitarian aid, if you like, to the rebuilding of Haiti. And so I think the point you've made is enormously strong. But then when we come to you, Dylan, you're a government. You know, you're a big chap, and you've got 0.7% of our GDP, which is a wonderful and miraculous achievement, and must be fought all the way to be sustained and if anything increased. But then you have to relate ultimately to these very small organic projects on the ground, and you've got to relate to an organization which isn't directly delivering, but is in fact enabling. How do you do it? How do you decide how to spend the money?
Oh, it's a challenging question. I mean, first of all, it's great to be here, and it's really nice to be here actually with some of our strongest partners. I mean, I would say that the work that Christian Aid does in the field is fantastic. You work in some of the most awful places, and your people deliver to some of the most vulnerable in the world, as do those represented by Sean's START network. I mean, in terms of how we work to support those on the ground in local organisations, I mean, I think it's quite challenging for us to do that as an organisation directly, but we can do that working through international NGOs. And increasingly, we are seeing a rise in local NGOs, organisations like Mercy Malaysia, where we are more confident about working with those regionally. But I want to just step back a little bit to look at the kind of question you asked at the beginning. You know, basically, is the system broken? Are we seeing, with the number of crises we've got at the moment, you know, we've got rapid population growth, urbanisation, climate change. We will see more disasters in the future. We know at the moment the situation is very strained, the system's strained. How can we deal with that? And I think Nick made a really strong point about this whole area around resilience and preparedness. We know that if we can invest much more upfront in the sort of preparedness systems and resilience systems, which include both governments and civil society and business, it's much cheaper actually to mount a response. So our money, our very stretched finances will go beyond what we can do with the sort of slight sticking plaster of humanitarian aid. So we really need to focus much more on that resilience. I think a challenge for a number of years has been this whole link between the humanitarian sector and the development sector. We are seeing gains moving forward on this, but again, I've been recently out in Haiti, working with the government of Haiti, looking at how they can invest through their national planning, recognising the impact on economic growth that disasters have every time they happen, to again build resilience. And I think it's just that sort of system that we need to encourage. Innovation, private sector, really vital parts of that. How can we get more financing into the system? And one of the things we're looking at is insurance. So how can we encourage insurance markets across the world so that actually that can fund some of these local organisations to be able to do those responses better?
How would that work?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, maybe you should pass that on to Sean, because I know that the START Network's also been looking at how they can provide a resource to the insurance sector in terms of actually providing that capacity so that where you can't necessarily fund government straight after a response, if that's been wiped out, the NGOs through their local partners can come in. But can I just make one other point? It's all very well to say this for natural disasters, but in conflict situations, it's quite different. And I think there are a lot of challenges. Maybe we'll come on to that later, but there are an awful lot of challenges there which are slightly different.
Why don't you quickly address the insurance? It sounds the most extraordinary idea.
It is, and in one way or other, I'm affiliated, and the people on the panel are my bosses, so I have to be careful with what I'm about to say. But it's, I agree with everything that's been said so far, and perhaps a little nuance here and there, just but to answer the insurance question specifically, it's the system needs to change. Aid organizations need to get more sophisticated in how they work with risk, and using the insurance industry is a very clear way where some types of risks are offloaded to capital markets, and then the
like what?
Like a type of typhoon that happens once every 5 years.
Yeah.
It's unaffordable to insure against a typhoon that happens 5 times a year, and unrealistic to insure against a typhoon that happens once every 10 years. But there's
anybody
a
here
sweet
from
spot
the
there.
insurance market? Not yet. Or if they are, they're too bashful to talk.
Well, I think the work with the private sector is a really important issue. The insurance is penetration in Japan, Florida, and Europe, and really there's a lot of the world that doesn't really have a lot of insurance penetration. So one of the new roles for international aid organizations is helping in industries like the insurance industry find new markets in the developing world so that these risks can be offloaded in a more sophisticated way.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Well, can we just talk about conflicts then, and responding to conflict emergencies? Do you want to talk about that?
With pleasure. I mean, I would only add that our organizations are responding with material assistance in conflict and to help with the trauma, but the demand is increasing. And the scale of need is completely surpasses what we've been able to, the capacity of the system that we've been able to build so far. and so perhaps another offering from the international organizations to become much more politically active, become more campaigning in nature, to try and address the causes of the conflicts. It's an obvious point, but it is very difficult for our colleagues in around the Syria crisis to see that the scale of suffering that's occurring there and be absolutely powerless to do anything about it.
But I mean, if the global community, in terms of nations, cannot address Syria, and they've proved they can't, what hope civil society can address it? What hope that NGOs wearing a more political hat have any chance of addressing it? I mean, what is happening in Syria is on such a megalithic scale and is so unaddressed, not the aid, but the issues. And of course, we've tried intervention in other places, and that's generated part of what we're looking at right now.
Well, I would just add one more thing, and I think that collaboration is an important part of the operating environment in the present, and it'll be more important in the future. I think that institutions like governments operating in the sort of 20th century mindset are unable to tackle the challenges of Syria. It requires an organization like Avaz, for example, with 35 million members that can get people on the streets in any country around the world on campaign issues that we should be looking to, and looking much more at ways for governments and civil society and the private sector to work together to address these. These are systemic problems that surpass any single organization.
What I said at the beginning, which is that if the wall hadn't come down, the situation in Syria would have been left to the Russians, because it would have been in their sphere of influence. But we've done nothing to recreate something which we can depend upon to resolve. I mean, it is as if anarchy is spreading. Is that a terrible thing to say? I think it might be, but it's true.
But we see it. I mean,
Yeah.
we're the canaries in the coal mine. It's not just the big crises that are half of human suffering occurs in small scale crises that don't reach the newspapers, and so we see this happening every day all over the place.
But the dynamic on the media, for example, not to lead on Syria, is extremely strong. I mean, if a Martian came here, Syria would be the lead story every day. I mean, they would say, listen, mate, climate change, Syria, starvation, failure to feed the planet, these are your top stories, and you should be hammering on at them, because that's what we'd like to know about, from Mars anyway.
But the
your
UN's
inability to feed yourselves.
The UN's own
inability
information
to resolve.
service.
What?
Just one more thing, John. The UN's information service itself is not allowed to report on the Syria crisis because of the institutional mechanisms that govern that particular organization.
What about any contributions to the floor? Yes, why not?
President Assad is causing all this destruction of his own country without any penalty whatsoever. It just seems to me absolutely ludicrous that he can carry on ad infinitum, and we, all of us, need to contribute to putting things back in some way or other. I mean,
It's a beautiful dream, but it's immensely complex. I mean, who radicalized the Iraqis to go steaming in there and committing acts of unspeakable violence and horror? I'm afraid we did. We went to war in Iraq. What's our responsibility as a consequence? These are the questions that Christian Aid likes to answer.
Fantastic.
There are unbelievably difficult questions there to try and answer. And yes, and we do try and say things about very complex political environments, whether it's in Syria or South Sudan, and in South Sudan, where for years and years we've been actively engaged in working with the churches and others to try and bring peace through local.
But Nick, this what's happened is Sally has asked a very specific question. She wants Assad dealt with. No. I mean, this may sound a banal question, but if Christian Aid is trying to break into the mindset of ordinary citizenry has a sort of grasp of where the tragedy points are, but cannot answer these questions. And in a sense, you're asking for money to help people who are being displaced by a horrific war, but can't really explain what's going on in simple terms.
It's not simple.
We can't either. We the media
either.
can't.
I mean, it is an unbelievably complex situation in Syria and the surrounding countries. I think we all need to recognise that and do what we can to make sure that we can do what we can based on the information that we have from the partners who are working in Syria, who are working in Iraq, who are working in Lebanon, bringing those views quietly into the mix. It's not something we can shout out about publicly, and we're not going to do that, to make sure people understand and know what the huge complexities of that is, to try and bring some of those voices into the discussions. And you say that it's not something that small local organisations can be involved in, but it is. I mean, making sure that the voices of local civil society is included in the discussions in trying to resolve the horrific things that are going on in Syria. It's essential. But from a humanitarian organisation perspective, what we can do is do what we can to provide humanitarian assistance to those who are needed. And actually, despite all the huge problems in Syria, the humanitarian side is we are providing what we can. Even just today, and this is not to do with Christian Aid, but a huge refugee camp has been built in Jordan, recognising that the problem is going to go on for years and years to come, which is awful to say it is, but actually that humanitarian support is being provided.
This project, for example, includes a seriously committed educational programme for the kids, which is also a huge need, that we have to build civic capacity in these places, because if we don't, we breed an alienated population that will never ever be able to function fully in the rest of the world.
You want to make sure you can do whatever you can for people who have been forced to flee their homes,
in a way, perhaps
the basics and education support, to have some semblance of normality there. Maybe I can see Janet, who's our head of the Middle East region, who may be able to answer some of these questions a little bit.
I think Nick has absolutely talked clearly about some of the complexities that we do face on Syria. It is a protracted crisis. It is going to go on for years, and we do need to try and look at alternative ways of responding. So yes, while we're able to do a lot of assistance, providing food, providing shelter, providing blankets, cooking equipment, etc., working on education, working on providing psychosocial support, as we call it in the trade, which helps people to deal with the trauma. It is everybody in Syria that is suffering from this.
This is such a useful microcosm, because in fact, basically, what Christian Aid and its agencies are doing on the ground there represents what can be done. You cannot resolve the Syrian crisis, but you can develop resources for people who are displaced that will give them a quality of life, which may not be as good as being settled back in Syria, but is a quality of life which will enable them themselves to develop. If we don't do that, then the consequences of not just the failure to resolve Syria, but the failure to resolve the individual lives of those who are displaced will come back to haunt us in all sorts of horrendous ways, in which we are now already seeing across other countries, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, maybe I can just come in, Jon.
Do.
I mean, for us, of course, Syria, it's our biggest ever humanitarian response, 600 million. It will go on, it's protracted. I agree with everything that's been said. I think it's really critical to point out that we must keep the humanitarian aid impartial, neutral and independent if it's to have impact. And actually, a lot of our funding does go through civil society organisations, and it's those civil society organisations through local organisations that are delivering a lot of the support to those in the most vulnerable, most difficult parts of Syria. And I don't think we should forget that. But there are also immense challenges in terms of how we do this. I recently sat on a panel looking at disability and older people. Those people are really hard to target in Syria. The things like chronic disease, how do you support that in some of the camps in the region? It's really, really difficult. Urban, there's a lot of people who are not in camps, who are living with domestic settings in the surrounding countries. How do we manage to support those kind of people? So there are these huge challenges it's throwing up, and I think whilst there is a political track which the Foreign Office for the UK government are leading, it's also important that we keep the humanitarian separate, and we do look at access, making sure that we can do that where possible, but also making sure that all the different bits of population are supported, even those in regime-held areas, which is more where our support through the UN is providing support.
Any other points from the floor anyone would like to raise before we move on? Yes.
Could I be provocative and ask the panel if they would offer their current appraisal of the performance of the United Nations in the humanitarian sphere, whether they think it is doing as well as it could? Because we're desperately short of supranational global governance organizations. The United Nations is as good as we've got. And it must be a relevant question to say, how good is it at delivering what everyone here is trying to deliver?
Sure.
The UN is staffed by extraordinary people. If you've ever met a UN official, multilingual, highly educated, committed, hardworking, and they're stuck in a 20th century industrial framework with states that are unwilling to expend any political capital to change it. This is the problem. Is that if it didn't exist, we'd have to recreate it. We need the UN. It's staffed by incredible people, and they are hamstrung by the frameworks that they work within. And this country, if we had chips to play on a particular issue, we'll play those chips for trade or security issues. We won't play the chips for changing the incentive structures and how the UN works.
Randolph, you're the analyst.
Let me just say, and formerly the UN. So I've got to be very careful, my pension's at stake. But having said that, I think Sean was perfectly right. Here you have, about the exquisite nature of UN officials. No, more about the whole question of being hamstrung. 192 states determine, if you like, what the system and how it behaves. However, let me just give you what I would see my instant vision of what I think the UN should be doing. I think the first thing that the UN should be doing is getting out of operational...
No, he was asking very specifically, how would you evaluate what it's doing?
Oh, what it's doing.
Yeah.
Actually, let me... Can I twist that around? John, give me a bit of
We're pretty tight on these things.
Because...
He asked a very dangerous question, which a lot of people wouldn't want to have to answer.
Okay, the challenge is there. In terms of recent performance, to be perfectly frank with you, I think we are caught up in the kind of global transition where there is really very little that this multilateral institution can do. And Syria, I think, is a very, very good case in point. And in a sense, it's because the UN has never been designed to be an effective intermediary in deeply conflictual civil wars, and that's what we're seeing. So that's the first point. Having said that, going back to ancient history, which John started off with by talking about the Berlin Wall, there was something also called Operation Lifeline Sudan, right around that same point. And here the United Nations, I think, really did show its effectiveness because it did two things. Because it approached the Sudanese government and the Sudanese opposition in a way that was deeply respectful. And we didn't want to get involved in your politics. We're not saying who is right or wrong. All we're saying is, give us access. So there are unbelievable moments when the United Nations has done extraordinary work. But the fact of the matter is, whatever you say about humanitarian principles, etc., the United Nations is a deeply political organization and is constrained by that. And I think that is the fundamental issue. That's the answer to your question. There's another question you should be asking, but the chair won't let me.
No. Have your pound of flesh for a minute. Go on.
Basically, get the UN out of operational activities. Because what this does is to, if you like, complicate. Am I here to get donor funding so that I can deliver food? Or alternatively, this is the vision. If you take a look at what the kind of crises we'll be facing in the future, this deep interlinking between technological hazards, natural hazards, conflict, etc., what the global system needs is someone to monitor these events, if you begin to start saying, this is what might be happening, be aware, who has no vested interest in doing anything other than being anticipatory, trying to form new kinds of partnerships around the world, to use the extraordinary network that the UN has to be far more innovative and to promote innovation. And all of a sudden now you have holes filled in the humanitarian sector which need to be filled if we're really going to cope with the kind of crises we have to cope with. So the UN, get it out of operations, far more anticipation, far more advocacy, far more approach to innovation, and far more facilitating partnerships. And then you have an effective UN for the 21st century. Thank you, John.
Very helpful. I mean, the only thing I would say as a hack who's observed the UN in operation, I absolutely agree with what's been said about the fantastic quality of the personnel. When you go to Gaza, for example, which is a horrific situation, which really the UN is the lead in attempting to try and resolve in terms of humanitarian assistance. Brilliant personnel. And I went the other day to Greenland with Ban Ki-moon. I spent 3 days up there with him. There were very few other people around. There are very few people in Greenland to begin with, but yeah, the transport is so limited that there were very few of us with him. I think 3 other journalists altogether. And what struck me was that he was actually doing precisely what you're asking of him. He was looking at climate change, and by God, it's rampaging across Greenland. I mean, the melting of the ice cap is devastating. And because they've been monitoring it for the last 50 years, the UN has been monitoring it for the last 50 years, they can see the retreat of the ice cap and mark it. And it's 12.5 miles every 10 years, retreating. And that you take 12.5 miles all the way around a country 15 times the size of Britain, with a population of 50,000, admittedly, but nevertheless, you see it. That's got to be going somewhere, and it's coming this way. You know, I mean, and I thought it was very good to see the Secretary General, who comes in for an awful lot of stick, very committed to climate change, slightly charisma-free zone, sweet man, but very committed on climate change, and actually he is now putting his entire personal commitment into climate change above anything else. And he's got a summit coming in September during the General Assembly, and he's got another in Peru and another in Paris coming up, and one hopes people will sign up to some sort of meaningful action. But I don't know whether we're on track in the way that Christian Aid wanted us to talk. Are there bits you'd like to bring up that we have not begun to address?
Well, I think maybe just following on from the question about the reforms of the UN, there are some very positive things. Some of the reforms that have taken place. Much stronger humanitarian coordinators, better trained, so you get the very good coordinators in places where they're needed. It does make a huge difference. I remember when I started, there were some not such good coordinators, or they weren't even coordinators, people who actually had no experience in humanitarian work, trying to manage large responses. Didn't work. Now you've got highly trained people who know what they're doing in places. Makes a big difference. There's a mechanism called the cluster mechanism, where the coordination of different sectors, whether it's shelter, food, health, or whatever, and there's much greater coordination in the response. But one of the things that I think needs a lot more work doing, and it goes back to making sure that local organisations, local civil society, are equally able to access those coordinating mechanisms. One of the big problems, and John, you would have seen it in Haiti when you were there, is that all the, because they were so easily accessible, lots of international organisations who had no history whatsoever in Haiti came steaming in, pushing aside Haitian civil society organisations. One of our partners was not able even to get into one of the coordination meetings because they were Haitian. Those are the sorts of things that we really need to address. And I think Christian Aid works very hard to do that. We do whatever we can to make sure our partners are able to get access to these coordinating mechanisms. And the UN really needs to do a lot more on that. Another area which needs greater focus is actually accountability. We have accountability, and we've been accountable to our institutional donors like DFID, to the general public for their massive support that we get. But to me, actually, we can be much more accountable to both DFID, to our general public, if we are sure that the people who we are working with, whether it's the Syrian refugee in Iraq, whether it's people displaced in South Sudan, or people affected by the Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, if we talk to the affected populations and make sure that they are satisfied and happy with what we are delivering, that they have dignity in what they work, and having strong accountability mechanisms in place. And now, with improved technology, we're in a far better place than we ever were to just ask simple questions. Did you get what you needed? Was it what you needed? Was it timely, etc.? And those sorts of things.
How would you respond to that?
Absolutely. It's one of the key things, and it's something that we're really keen to champion as we lead up to the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. I think the difficulty at the moment is...
What is that about?
Where should the humanitarian system go? Beyond, to deal with the kind of current challenges that we're facing, to look at how the UN is responding to the sort of crisis things, to look at donors, to look at new donors, to look at private sectors. There's a whole range of things, resilience, links with development, post-2015, post the Millennium Development Goals. So that there's big issues there. However, just on the accountability thing, I think we have a real challenge to take this to scale. We can do it piecemeal at the moment, but as Nick says, new technology is really critical, but there are also new mechanisms, things like using cash. We're looking at how can we scale up much more in response, providing people with cash direct, because therefore you can use that how you want to. So I think we need to do more. The international system needs to do more, but there are huge challenges in doing this, and I think we need to break out of maybe some of the old ways of looking at this and look at how can we use new technology and mechanisms.
Any questions from the floor? Any points? Yes.
Is there a central gatekeeper that coordinates aid like this when an event occurs or a sudden disaster?
You're the gatekeeper, aren't you, Sean? Isn't that exactly what you do?
For the NGOs, for the civil society, yeah, we have a consortium called the START Network that enables us to coordinate.
Will you talk to Christian Aid then and say this is what we're doing?
Well, Christian Aid, Nick's the chair of the board actually, so he's fully involved. But the UN has a system of institutionalized coordination, so that there is a leader in every crisis, and there's various committees.
How do you all communicate with Doctors Without Borders or other groups that enter into these?
There are different coordinating mechanisms at different places. If you're looking at in country where there's a crisis, there would be the UN coordinating mechanisms, which I was talking about earlier. You would also have government coordinating mechanisms, and we should all be working through government coordinating mechanisms where, certainly in natural disasters, the government will be coordinating. In the Philippines, very good coordinating mechanisms. There are problems, but the scale of the disaster...
Let's, for example, take quite a recent conflict disaster. Central African Republic. I mean, it's, 3 years old, basically. I mean, something like that. Just give us a picture of how people would come together on what was a very obscure part of the world.
In Central African Republic, there would be UN coordinating mechanisms set up and in place to coordinate the work of all the different agencies there. So with that, they would coordinate the different UN agencies, the World Food Programme, UNICEF and others. They'd also be linking the NGOs who would be working there, would also be linking into those coordinating mechanisms. In UK, there would be the agencies who are working in Central African Republic will be coordinating in one way or another. And I'm sure through DFID there would be regular discussions with those who are working there. So we make sure, as far as we possibly can, that the work is coordinated. There's
a neat little sort of side from this, though. I mean, you're not alone. There'll be Oxfam. There'll be all sorts of other people, Islamic Relief, etc., all bidding for a share of his pie, saying, "Look, we know the ground better than he does. Give it to us." Is it like that, or is it all? I say no. Do give Islamic Relief.
I think this is somewhere where we have moved on a lot in the last few years. I think 5 plus years ago there was a lot. There was a competition between the different agencies. I think since we had something called the Consortium of British Humanitarian Agencies, which has now morphed into the START network, where 19 of the main UK agencies work together to look and see where the crises are. Any one of us can actually raise an alert and say we need to respond there. The agencies get together and say, yes, we're going to release some of the funds, which has come from DFID, and we're hoping to get support from elsewhere. And then we actually peer review the work that we're doing. So we can say, actually, Christian Aid, you're not doing very much in country X, but Islamic Relief or Oxfam or SAVE, you're doing a lot there. So the funds will go there. to those organisations. And we're actually, I was on a group which was actually allocating those funds in a previous thing. And we had very, very tough discussions between us, because I couldn't advocate for Christian Aid, nor could Oxfam advocate for Oxfam, but we all looked at it at the programmes and challenged what was being done. And I think it really improved the quality of the work. It made us all think about, actually, are we really best placed to deliver there? Surely Action Aid are better there, or Muslim Aid, or Islamic Relief are better in those places. Then it is shifted from where we were a few years ago. But it's a challenging thing.
Very good question, helpful, and very good answers. Any other points from the floor? We've got a couple of minutes left. Yeah.
I'm Rob Vermeze from the Awareness Fund. Question from Mr. Goodman. We are probably one of the first charities to reach an area where a disaster has taken place, political or nature. Then once you're there, our organisation will start flying in as well, they're experts. And I'm coming back to our American friend. Who then coordinates? Is the world then dependent on the United Nations to coordinate?
It depends where it is. In Philippines, where we were right at the beginning, it was Philippines government, local government, who were doing most of the coordination. The UN were there, but actually there was very good local government structures and government structures who were able to coordinate, certainly in the initial phases. Unfortunately, a lot of those who fly in from outside don't join those coordinating mechanisms and think they can just go off and do things for themselves. And that is hugely challenging. And they may come in when the UN start coordinating. And in Philippines, it took the UN were in Manila, they were in Cebu and the regions, but they were not able to get out to the much more remote areas where the needs actually were. Local government was there, so the local mayors were coordinating. So local civil society, those who were already there, coordinated through those mechanisms. It's challenging, and I think the whole way in which our system works and the agencies who are not already working in a country really need to consider, do they really add any additional value by going in? Surely they should be supporting those who are already there. And I think donors, the big international, the institutional donors, have an obligation also to make sure, to question those coming in, saying, yes, you may be an emergency response agency, but are there others who are already there who can deliver much better through their existing mechanisms? But whenever you've got an emergency, you need to scale up, because by definition, the local capacity itself can't deliver. It has to have some
Can I just take your neighbour?
In terms of practicality and effectiveness, the use of local personnel and local organisation makes very, very good sense. But in terms of being sure the money and funds are well spent, how is that ensured? These are countries in which governance and corruption is not unknown. And there is always, I think all donors must have this fear that they're contributing to an excellent organisation that has great achievements.
Well, let me go to Diffid, because after all, he's spending your money for sure.
First of all, we've set up a mechanism called the Rapid Response Facility, which is a pre-qualified system for 36 NGOs and a number of private sector organisations, where we do a lot of due diligence in advance, looking at their whole fiscal policy, fiduciary risk, how they're audited, etc. All these guys are part of that. That acts both as our coordination mechanism, but also helps us know who's where in the world. So we're not sending in people on planes. We're working very much more locally. Now, we will rely, unfortunately, for these kind of emergencies where we don't have country offices necessarily. We will rely very much on the NGO partners, and we sort of transfer some of that risk to the NGO partners in terms of how the money flows down to the local level. We do due diligence on that, but we rely very much on the quality of the international civil society organisations to basically build those local partnerships and ensure that risk is managed. And we will hold those international organisations like Christian Aid to account for how they pass those funds through to local organisations.
I know you want. I just want to check to see if there's anybody who wants to burst in with another question before we go, because that will be the last question. Is there anything else on the floor? So Nick, go ahead.
Yes, I'm just following up on that, because I think it's a real problem and a real issue that we need to make sure we address. And right through my career, from when I was working in Ethiopia in a sort of small urban program where I'd sort of check the numbers of nails that were being used in house reconstruction, through to what I'm doing now, I think it is absolutely critical that the work that is being done is properly reported on, and we recognise that there is always potential, especially in crises, for corruption to take place, for food to be diverted in different places. For Christian Aid, we have monitoring reporting systems that DFID are happy with, to enable us to check to make sure there's a sort of paper trail of exactly where things go and what happens to it. So that's more for sort of functional accountability is all in place, and we have people who go and check that as well, because we do. I mean, we have staff who will go and support our partners in making sure that is happening and working with them. But in addition to that, some of the things and what we did during the tsunami, what we did in Haiti and other places, is actually provide sort of finance, sort of accountant type people to go and help the local organisation make sure that their systems are in place so they can deliver on those things. Because if you're a small organisation, community organisation which has had a budget of $100,000 a year, and suddenly you get a massive input of funds from outside, maybe multiplying the size of their organisation by 5, the systems themselves struggle to cope with that, and we have to provide support for that. But one of the difficulties with doing that is that the public, when we sort of say how much you're spending on direct food and blankets, don't want to spend it on providing accountants or logisticians to help do that. And it's a really difficult message to get over, but without that type of support, the organisations will struggle. So we will always provide that sort of thing.
Right.
I'll just come back to my final thing, just about accountability to affected population. If you're in a refugee camp and you're meant to be receiving 2 blankets and 5 kilos of maize and whatever else, and you're told you're going to get it, and then you turn up, you go to the distribution point and you get 1 blanket and 1 kilo of maize. If you don't have a right to actually speak out and say, "Oi, that's not what I should have got. I should have got much more," the corruption is going to take place. If you make sure the transparency is there, people know what they're meant to be getting, and the systems are in place for people to complain and hold those delivering to account, you'll hugely reduce the corruption. So for us, that sort of accountability to the affected populations is absolutely critical, and will do probably in the long run more than anything else to reduce corruption, and also empower people to be stronger and actually stand firmer and be stronger in the future to stand up to the local authorities, government and anybody else who may be trying to oppress them.
Well, a very positive way to end a very challenging debate about a very challenging time and huge issues. I'm incredibly grateful to our panel, to Randolph, Nick, Dylan, Sean, but above all to you and to Latham and Watkins for making this possible. I think it's been a really interesting session. I hope you've learned as much as I have. I feel I've learned a lot. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.